Okay, so I think we all agree that it's important to manage the commons if we're going to have a quality of life now and into the future, which really is the focus of sustainability. So there's lots of ways to manage the commons. We're going to look at taxes, government regulation, incentives, privatization, finding substitutes or new reserves, which we're going to focus on a lot today. Cap and trade markets, pretty cool. And cooperative agreements between players in the free market and in the commons to manage resources. We can increase taxes on those people who are damaging the environment to change their behaviors. We certainly can use regulations. The great thing about governments in the pure sense is they tend to think over the long term and think about indirect benefits versus companies which tend to think in the short term. So here's an example. New York City, on the building on the right in the early 20th century, we're building taller and taller buildings that were totally blocking out the sunlight from the sidewalks. So nobody down here in these poor little sidewalks could get any sunlight. And so what happened was the government interceded or intervened, depending on how you look at it, to generate a policy that would force new construction, right, to follow a stepped model to let more sunlight down into the street level and sidewalks. This would be, we could say that sunlight is a common, or daylight is something that should be commonly experienced or obtainable by anybody, regardless of their economic status. So the government interceded here to generate buildings that look like this. So this building steps based on this principle right here. So that's one of many, many examples that we use in order to protect the commons. And I'll have more going on as we go through the lecture. Now, what you really need to understand is something called reserves. And we learned that the free market looks at reserves. They think they're endless because as the price goes up, this will lead to more investment in technology to get more of those reserves, more exploration to get more of those reserves, or developing substitute technologies in place of those reserves. And this is really critical, foundational concept to understand for sustainability. So if you read your chapter 1 from the book Abundance, which I think was a really interesting book, certainly a free market perspective, lots of opportunities to generate wealth. I mean, essentially, I can get rich by developing reserves or finding substitutes. And that's a driver, that's a human motivation, that's a driver. Again, not necessarily evil. It's not evil to want to extract gas from the ground through the process of fracking, for example, but things can go wrong or things can go right. Tar sands, we're going to talk about in a minute, is another way to get oil, which would be really an extension of reserves. Deep sea oil rigs, we can look at those. So here's the tar sands. These are gigantic installations, gigantic scars on the earth, but the direct benefits are pretty obvious. Wealth creation for some, those investors who took the risk, and certainly job creation for others where they can make a better living. So, this is not in dispute. And certainly more energy for society makes more security for those residents in that part of the world. That can only be considered a direct benefit. But we worry about externalities. What are the kinds of externals, or if you remember my math equation, the remainder of the equation that generates problems for us? So some of the negative externalities are destruction of habitat. And we worry about that because, people live here, people that have lived here for thousands of years in a certain kind of way of life who can no longer support themselves through subsistence economies because the natural habitat has been destroyed. More carbon in the atmosphere. This is probably the dirtiest oil to manufacture and burn, which leads to more climate change and more global warming. And certainly loss of life from train explosions. Because there's a lack of pipelines, we're using trains to transport this very dirty energy, very explosive energy through the US right now. And we're seeing people literally losing their lives from train crashes. This is the ultimate negative externality. And obviously sustainability, we would like to address these externalities without compromising the ability of people to make a profit and to create jobs. That's really the trick. Deep sea oil rigs is a great example of finding more reserves. There's lots of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. In the US, we sort of hit peak oil in 1970 and had to go offshore. Problem is that we have negative externalities from this. 4.9 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf, damage to ecosystems, and also damage to tourism, loss of income. And 11 people died in this too, by the way, which is the ultimate externality. The only thing that's interesting for me is, and optimistic for me, is that BP actually accounted for paid reparations of over $11 billion to make up for this accident. So we're seeing an increased level of transparency in the 2010s, and we're seeing more accountability, which is pretty exciting. Those of you who are interested in fracking and what that means in the US, here's a little map that shows the number of earthquakes, 2009 to present. Very exceedingly different from what we've seen in the past in terms of earthquakes in Oklahoma. So we start to say, oh my God, what is going on with fracking? Why are there all these earthquakes? and we begin to think about that as a negative externality, that these earthquakes are damaging property and creating a psychological uncertainty that probably is not great. And we know there's a real problem with wastewater and fracking. For those fracking operations that are not following proper procedures, we know there's a danger of environmental pollution. On the other hand, though, the direct benefits are job creation and wealth creation. You know, people are selling their land and their mineral rights to those people who are fracking. It is true, though, that you don't own the rights underneath your property, and there is a lot of horizontal drilling that's going on. So fracking is something we're going to get into in week 5 of this course in great detail. Here we're just really focusing on direct benefits and externalities. I hope that's been helpful to you. So that really ends our little lecture on managing the commons. We're really going to be spending the whole semester on how to manage the commons. This is just a little introduction to reserves. Next thing we're going to be doing is talking about substitutes, which I'm far more excited about. Okay, so I'm really excited about substitutes. Rather than going out all over the world and finding more reserves and creating more negative externalities, what I can do is find substitutes for those materials and resources that actually give far more benefit to society with far less of the negative externalities. It's pretty exciting, actually. So a good example is copper. So we use copper for telephone wires, and in the 1990s or so, copper was getting more scarce and more expensive. That creates the perfect opportunity for a substitute to emerge. In other words, there's an incentive or motivation for a company to find an alternative to copper where they can go out and make a lot of money and, in fact, also decrease the impacts on the earth. So here we're looking at the idea of fiber optics. So the idea of using sand to make a fiber optic tube that can communicate information much faster than copper, by the way. So there's all sorts of other great upsides. So what would that mean for, say, I don't know, oil? Could we find substitutes for oil? And some would believe that we're in peak oil now. Some would believe that we're moving into that. But rather than finding more oil, couldn't we find substitutes that generate electricity or power that can benefit society? And solar power has emerged really only because oil got more expensive. And you guys got to understand this. High costs of materials and resources actually spurs the market to generate substitutes like solar power. And so what's really exciting, for example, if you look at solar power, which is very expensive, it does rely on market changes to work. So as oil prices go up, the cost of solar goes down. It's a really simple inverse relationship. And if you look at solar, I'm just going to use my mouse here, this is what the price of solar was in 1970. It was ridiculous. Now it's here at 2013. It's 100 times less than it was only 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, this is amazing, right? And solar right now is only 18% efficient. So part of the reserves of solar is to use technology to actually get solar panels to generate more electricity. This is really the heart of the substitutes and why sustainability people get so excited about the concept. However, we always have to be aware that as we generate new substitutes, new externalities emerge. So, for example, when solar panels were first installed in the US, there was no provisions to shut the power down in a fire. So guess what happened? Firemen lost their life fighting fires with live solar arrays on the roof. Over time, we've developed regulations to make sure that that doesn't happen. And look at the growth of renewable energy. I mean, this is amazing. So as oil gets more expensive, renewable energy gets more viable. This is a good thing, and this is how the free market can actually work for sustainability instead of against it. So the spirit of entrepreneurship is there, and renewable energy is a great example. I'm pretty excited about it, and this is why I'm optimistic about sustainability. Now, if you're watching this lecture in 2015, I think you all know that oil crashed this year, which has really caused a ripple in this whole model of a market-driven sustainability solution. So all of a sudden, fracking and tar sands are not viable anymore because we're getting plenty of oil from countries that get it more easily, which means on the one hand, negative externalities down, less pollution. On the other hand, the drive for substitutes goes away. So look at the great thing about solar. I mean, this is an actual project in London where they actually took the entire roof of a bridge and put solar panels on top. That is remarkable. And remember, we're talking about a decentralized power opportunity here versus oil, which is completely centralized. And in week 5, we're going to look at the advantages of not just the advantages of externalities, but the other kind of economic and feasibility advantages of these kinds of materials. Solar thermal, I was out towards Las Vegas this summer, and these are amazing solar thermal arrays, which actually use mirrors rather than photovoltaic panels to generate power. And there's all kinds of externalities from these and benefits. So the direct benefit is reduced carbon emissions. It's amazing. Some of the externalities might be, well, lots of birds are dying and local habitats are impacted. So there's not a silver or green bullet to the energy crisis or opportunity. There's always going to be negative externalities that have to be managed and weighed, for example. And wind power, you got to love it, right? This is amazing what's happening with wind power. Some of the externalities here or direct benefits are reduced carbon emissions, wonderful. But we are seeing problems with the death of bats and birds, which is creating an ecosystem imbalance. So none of these technologies are perfect, and certainly the aesthetic or experiential quality of these can be either very good or very bad. So there could be a negative externality of the view, for example, if you happen to live in a house where you see these over in the distance. So that really ends our look at, and our last part is, and one of my favorites is conservation, the idea of using less energy so that we can conserve it and make it extend into the future. So the term we use for this is the negawatt, which is a unit of energy that is never used, which is really one of the great basis of sustainable design of decreasing demand. So historic preservation, for example, every time we reuse a building, we're generating negawatts of energy that are not used to create a new building. Every energy efficient technology we use is conserving those resources into the future. LED bulbs, for example, are a great example of that. Building better envelopes for buildings, clearly an obvious way of creating negawatts. And then green building rating systems ultimately help us to do this. It's a very complex process to figure out where to put our money and where not to put our money to generate opportunities. So, I'm going to be lecturing on many, many rating systems from all over the world this semester in my next course. But right now, just looking at the LEED rating system, for example, one of the great things about LEED is it's a system by which we can protect the commons, water, air, energy, etc., but we're doing it through a private industry initiative. In other words, the government's not requiring LEED. LEED is optional, which is pretty great, right? It helps us to extend the reserves into the future and certainly encourages us to find substitutes like solar. So LEED is a driver of us to help our motivations move in the right direction. And also what's great about this is rather than having the government tell us whether we should be sustainable or not, companies are choosing to do LEED at different levels rather than that being regulated. It's pretty exciting. And that actually ends the invisible hand, where next time we're going to be looking at the expanding circle, which is going to be pretty exciting. So I hope you'll join me for that.